Dear clients, my team and I are here to present an action plan for your company to propose specific aims in order to answer what type of qualities must an SR represent in order to create a successful business expansion in Asian and non-Asian countries. The following aims and objectives that we wish to achieve are: number 1, to determine what characteristics of service representatives should be most valued when targeting specific demographics. Number 2, to determine whether respondents preferred service reps from the same race as themselves or not, which demonstrates any racial bias. And number 3, to examine whether respondents from demographics perceive different levels of expectations towards personal encounters. Basic descriptions of the data. The data contains 22 questions which allowed respondents the option to choose between strongly disagree to strongly agree. The data was open to all age groups, the highest qualification being postgrad to below Year 12. The data included 13 factors to be evaluated against overall satisfaction. The total number of people that completed the survey was 2,471 respondents. The demographics here shows that 46.7% were males and 53.3% were females that completed the survey. The majority of respondents were Australian, Chinese and Indonesian, as shown in the table. The regions include 54.2% from Oceania, 19.4% from East Asia and 17.3% from Southeast Asia. During our initial acquaintance with the dataset, we also utilized descriptive statistical methods in order to generate a snapshot of age composition. The mode of our demographic of our sample was within 18 to 25 years old, which is 84.2%. This showed that 49.4% of our respondents were full-time students. What we found. In our initial analysis of the data, we found that 641 respondents, 25.9%, did not correctly answer a trick question designed to test their attentiveness towards the survey. For the purposes of accurate reporting and recommendation for managers, we have decided to omit these responses, as we assume the possibility that these respondents may have given unreliable data for the other components of the survey. Therefore, we are left with a collapsed sample size of 1,830 responses after cleaning up the data. Now, Mathilde will talk about the value labels.
During our preliminary analysis of the data, one prominent aspect that we encountered was the fact that the value labels of the survey were anchored by conflicting attributes. So by going into the variable view in SPSS and examining the value labels assigned, we found that on one side of the scale, the questions were anchored by the measure strongly disagree, while the polar measurement was strongly important. Within the field of research and data collection, the theory states that surveys should always be anchored by consistent scales. So for example, if one end of the scale is strongly agree, then the opposite end of the scale must always be strongly disagree. Therefore, because the data set given to us has conflicting scale measurements, at this point in our analyses, we actually require clarification as to whether there are errors in the compilation of the data or whether the survey has been naturally structured this way. If the survey was naturally structured with these two differing scales, then this has implications towards the final results generated in future analyses, since disagreement and importance are two different concepts measuring completely different ideas. Therefore, at one stage of our project, we intend to contact the data collator to clarify the scale discrepancy to ensure that any future analysis with this data is true and meaningful for the manager. At this point in our project, we assume that the data is true and accurate. One of the tests we intend to use is ANOVA, specifically one-way ANOVA, and we intend to use it as a tool to analyze any questions requiring distinctions between different groups or categories. After our preliminary examination of the dataset, we identified that there are 3 prominent areas requiring ANOVA analysis, including questions based around demographic characteristics, such as education, age, and ethnicity, also known as country of origin in the survey. So in the statistical field, ANOVA is used specifically to determine the differences in the means of more than two groups. So put simply, it aims to see if any groups are specifically different or deviates from the status quo. Because this dataset is from a survey consisting of respondents from a multitude of nationalities, it would be specifically useful to find any differences between these nationalities in terms of how different cultures respond to definitions of quality customer service, where we would utilize SR characteristics such as rudeness, happiness, and attentiveness to structure our hypotheses. So using happiness as an example attribute, it would give us the following hypotheses: that H null, that there is no difference between ethnic groups and their perceptions of customer service with regards to happiness, and the alternate hypothesis, where there is a difference between ethnic groups and their perceptions of customer service with regards to happiness. However, because the ANOVA tool itself cannot tell us which specific groups will be potentially different, we will also require the use of post hoc tests, such as Tukey and Tamane's T2 tests. Depending on the value generated in the initial Levine's test in ANOVA, we will use the Tukey test if the value is insignificant, in other words, less than 0.05, while we will employ Tamane's T2 test if the value is significant or more than 0.05. The managerial value of running ANOVA post hoc test is that managers will better understand what course of action to take if a group turns out to be statistically different. For example, if Southeast Asian respondents were found to rate happiness differently, then further managerial attention of improving or examining the causes of this difference in perception will be beneficial to improving or fixing overall customer satisfaction issues. Furthermore, the ANOVA does not describe the direction of relationships, and therefore our next step in the analysis would be to use regression, and I will now hand over to Vincent to discuss this.
As previously mentioned, it is in the interest for the company to understand what type of SR they should hire as they open branches in Asian and non-Asian countries. In determining the attributes of individuals suitable for the position, we would like to first conduct a test that disregards the race of the SR, but focuses on what attributes in general affects the most regarding overall satisfaction with the service. Therefore, conducting a multivariate linear regression using overall satisfaction with the service as the dependent variable and the 7 attributes as the independent variables, we are able to determine the direction of what attributes affect overall satisfaction with the service the most, and whether it positively or negatively affects it. With this information administered, it provides the managers a greater understanding on what attributes they should be looking for in a potential candidate for the sales representative position in their new branches. Knowing what attributes positively affects overall satisfaction with the service the most definitely is beneficial to the company, as they can reduce costs in terms of employing inefficient SRs that do not add value to the firm, or avoid employing SRs that reduce overall satisfaction with the service. In addition, what SPSS derives is an equation that determines for every 1 unit an attribute increases or decreases, how it affects percentage-wise with overall satisfaction with the service. With this equation, managers will be able to effectively predict how certain attributes affect overall satisfaction and determine whether a certain candidate will be beneficial to the company before they actually commence working. For the next test, we will now have to include the race of the SR within the equation and have the country of origin by region as our selected variable. This time, we want to determine what attributes affects overall satisfaction with the service the most for each respondent according to their country of origin by region, with the equation taking into account the race of the SR and the customer. Therefore, we are planning to conduct a constrained dummy variable linear regression, which will identify which attributes are significant for each corresponding country by region of the respondent. With this information in hand, we would like to discover whether the value of these attributes differ between respondents in different regions of the world. Then we can determine whether it is a cultural issue that is affecting a customer's overall satisfaction with the service, as certain cultural values and customs may have clashed with the beliefs and values of the SR and the customer in the stimulus that was provided to them. What managers can do with this information is that they can identify which region is affected the most in terms of satisfaction with the service, and act accordingly in hiring suitable SRs that are able to adapt their communication skills, as well as be open-minded in terms of avoiding behaviors that might clash with certain respondents, affecting overall satisfaction with the service.
independent sample t-test is used to compare the means between two uncorrelated groups on the same continuous variable. We have decided to perform two independent sample t-tests by splitting up the variable of race into two groups. In the first, we are keeping the customer constant as non-Asian and looking at whether their overall satisfaction differs when the SR is Asian and when they are non-Asian. Therefore, we create the null hypothesis that when the customer is non-Asian, the overall satisfaction does not differ whether the service representative is Asian or non-Asian, meaning that the means are equal. The alternate is that when the customer is non-Asian, the overall satisfaction does differ whether the SR is Asian or non-Asian, meaning that the means are not equal. In the second independent sample t-test, we are keeping the customer constant as Asian and looking at whether their overall satisfaction differs when the SR is Asian and when again they are not Asian. Therefore, we generate the null hypothesis that when the customer is Asian, the overall satisfaction does not differ whether the SR is Asian or non-Asian. The alternate, when the customer is Asian, the overall satisfaction does differ whether the service representative is Asian or non-Asian. By completing these two separate tests, we are able to conclude whether the race of the respondent and the race of the SR affects overall satisfaction. We can also determine which particular groups are affected if overall satisfaction differed between the two groups. Managers will find this useful since they are choosing to open branches in Asian and non-Asian countries. It would be beneficial to know whether it's necessary that one type of country require a particular service representative. For example, our test may reveal that it is not necessary that an Asian service representative be employed in an Asian country.
A conjoint test revolves around investigating a number of different attributes at multiple levels. This method is performed in order to determine the return that employers receive when they hire a service representative with a specific set of characteristics. Furthermore, from the completion of the conjoint test in this scenario, we are also able to determine the importance of each individual attribute in providing more profitable return for the employer when seeking service representatives. Hence, employers will be able to identify which characteristics, as well as the level of characteristics, they should be looking for in a potential service representative. To better understand and investigate the conjoint method, part-worth utility must be taken into consideration. This is an important factor as it assists in ultimately determining which attribute is most important, which affects the final decision that employers make. It would also be beneficial to test the significance of each demographic against the individual respondents, considering factors such as education and qualification in the process. All the previously mentioned processes will allow for more rigid standards to be in place when setting a criteria for hiring service representatives. It must be noted that at the later stages of this project, as characteristic of the conjoint test, in order to determine the minimum number of cards to use, we would be finding the square root of the total number of combinations. However, this is for later consideration when the tests are being performed. The roadmap allows for the individual steps of the project to be clearly seen. The tasks that need to be undertaken at each stage are clearly identified, which helps minimize confusion as well as help the group keep track on project progress throughout the semester. 1. Send out survey links to respondents. Collect data from 50 individuals. 2. Establish a need for information. Step 1 in the marketing research process. 3. Establish information needs, which is step 2 in the marketing research process. 4. Group meetings both in person and online to plan tests that could be potentially used to analyze the data. 5. Analyze the data from the SAV file that was uploaded onto Moodle. 6. Plan the different types of tests to use to best analyze the data. 7. Decide on using regression, ANOVA, independent t-test, and conjoint analysis to analyze the data. 8. Record video presentation that details the preliminary thoughts and potential processes on analyzing the dataset. 9. Group meetings both in person and online to consolidate understanding and refine the interpretation of the results. 10. Consultation meeting with the lecturer to clarify queries with the group's analysis of the data. 11. Final consolidation and editing stage, collaborating all results and checking over the report to ensure there are no errors and interpretations are fully explained, excluding graphs and tables to better represent data. 12. Submit project report with full findings and analysis.
presentation shows our progress made to this project to date. In particular, our first stages of creating the managerial report will be clarifying a few points of uncertainty before we conduct all the tests aforementioned.
Thank you.